Boa noite. Meu nome é Anderson Lucarezzi. Estou aqui para mediar este encontro inicial, que é uma espécie de esquenta, uma atividade preparatória para o nosso fórum Diversamente, que vai acontecer na próxima segunda-feira, dia 20 de outubro, no Museu do Ipiranga, em São Paulo. É uma alegria estar aqui. Saúdo todos os espectadores, o professor Ari Ne'eman, com quem terei a alegria de conversar um pouco essa noite. Antes de começarmos, eu gostaria de fazer a minha audiodescrição. Eu sou um homem branco, nos meus 30 anos, eu tenho cabelos castanhos, uma barba, bigode, tenho olhos castanhos, estou usando óculos e uma camiseta básica cinza. Atrás de mim há uma cortina cinza. Gostaria de apresentar o professor Ne'eman, primeiramente em português e depois em inglês, pois temos também parte do público, possivelmente assistindo, falantes de inglês, e também para a gravação que será feita, que contará também com legendas. Professor Ari Ne'eman é professor assistente de Política e Gestão em Saúde na Escola de Saúde Pública T.H. Chan, da Universidade de Harvard. Ele cofundou a Autistic Self Advocacy Network e atuou como seu diretor executivo de 2006 a 2016. De 2010 a 2015, foi um dos indicados do presidente Barack Obama para o National Council on Disability. De 2020 a 2025, serviu como assessor sênior em deficiência no Office for Civil Rights do Departamento de Saúde e Serviços Humanos dos Estados Unidos, oferecendo consultoria sobre questões de discriminação e integração comunitária de pessoas com deficiência. Atualmente, está escrevendo um livro sobre a história do movimento de defesa dos direitos das pessoas com deficiência nos Estados Unidos ao longo dos últimos 200 anos. Agora, a breve apresentação em inglês. Ari Ne'eman is an assistant professor of health policy and management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He co-founded the Autistic Self Advocacy Network and served as its executive director from 2006 to 2016. From 2010 to 2015, he also served as one of President Obama's appointees to the National Council on Disability. From 2020 to 2025, he served as a senior disability advisor to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights, providing advice on issues regarding disability discrimination and community integration. He's currently writing a book on the history of American disability advocacy over the last 200 years. Okay, Professor Ari Ne'eman, welcome. You have the floor now. Thank you very much for your participation. Let me just remind you to start with your self-audio description, please.
Thank you very much. I am a bearded Jewish man wearing a purple polo shirt and a orange and blue kippah, and I have brown hair and glasses. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank you, Anderson, as well as Guilherme and all of the members of Autistas Brazil for the opportunity to participate with you in beginning Forum Diversamente. It's my understanding that you have a very active and exciting schedule planned for the coming week, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to be a part of it. Over the course of, and I just want to confirm that our slides are visible at this stage, are they?
Not yet.
Let's see if we can, here we go.
Now they are available.
Over the course of the last 20 years, I've had the privilege of being a part of the neurodiversity movement. Neurodiversity had humble beginnings, really beginning as just the instinctive sense on the part of a generation of autistic people that there was something wrong in how the broader society approached us, in the extent to which traditional autism advocacy dominated near exclusively by parents and professionals, really focused on questions of causation and cure, and left really no emphasis on the things that were most important to autistic people ourselves. Drawing inspiration from the broader disability rights movement slogan, "Nothing about us without us," we set out to try and change both the national but also the international conversation on autism by introducing the idea, core to the neurodiversity movement, that the objectives of society to autistic people and to people with a wide range of other neurological disabilities should not be to try and make people look and act normal, that the appropriate province of service providers is not to enforce typical appearance, but instead is to pursue more meaningful goals, things like communication, inclusion in the general education classroom, access to the workforce, support with a broad variety of adaptive skills, independent living, and other needs to enable people to be included and welcomed in the community, not as a false simulacrum of neurotypical appearance, but as who they are, as who we are, as autistic people who can be recognized and respected in our own right, rather than as a failure in being something we are not. Over the course of the last 20 years, neurodiversity has grown in prominence. We now see the term used all of the time in a wide variety of different, very high-ranking and prominent sectors in the universities, in much of the business community, even in many government and policy contexts. But at the same time, the overarching goal of the neurodiversity movement to shift the way that service provision, education, and research approaches autistic people and people with many other disabilities besides really remains unfulfilled. I have a great fear that in the years to come, neurodiversity may not be realized as the transformative concept that it has the potential to be, but instead become a disability euphemism. One more word that's used in place of those that came before it, without reflecting an actual change in the material circumstances of autistic people and the many other groups of people with disabilities that are increasingly placing their trust and their hopes for a better future in the neurodiversity movement. And so the topic of my talk today is really, what can we do to operationalize neurodiversity? What can we do to maximize impact for the neurodiversity movement by focusing in on the very concrete and measurable things that we want to change in how service provision approaches autism and autistic people? In the process, we may find ourselves brought into greater conflict with some entities who use the word neurodiversity without a full understanding of its true and transformative meaning. but also lesser conflict with other entities who may see in our desire for service provision that is responsive to what I think is the true priorities of the great majority of not just autistic people, but also family members. A movement that they realize is very much consistent with their interests and that can champion the interests of autistic people across the broad range of different experiences within the autism spectrum. Many of the ideas in this talk are reflected in a recent article that I and several colleagues, Kenneth Richman, Alison McCarthy, and Daniel Wilkenfeld, published about 2 years ago in the journal Ethics and Human Research, called A Passing Problem, Evaluating Harm and Benefit in Autism Research. If you have an interest, I encourage you to take a look at the article. And we use the word passing, and it's a little bit of a pun, but we also use the word passing in part because this is a word that really has a long history in the research on sociology and identity. Going back to the 1960s, Irving Goffman, one of the great sociologists of the 20th century, talked about passing as a common experience of those who had a stigmatized identity, whether it was because of disability, and Goffman had many examples about disabled people, or because of race, or sexuality, or religion, or any number of other forms of stigmatized identity. It's essentially the hiding of a part of oneself in order to avoid stigma and the consequences the world imposes upon the stigmatized persons. What Goffman and many other subsequent researchers and other commentators recognized is that the effort to pass imposes a cost, in many ways a tremendous cost, upon those who spend their time trying to be something they are not. And that this has a cost in terms of mental and sometimes physical health, that it shapes the self-image of the person who is endeavoring to pass, and that these costs are imposed not just on those who are truly hiding, who are pretending to be, if you are gay, pretending to be straight, if you are a member of a minority racial and ethnic group, pretending to be a part of the majority, if you are disabled, pretending to be non-disabled, is not just emerging from persons who are out and out hiding the fact of their stigmatized identity, but it also emerges when people are forced to cover characteristics associated with their stigmatized identity. Goffman talked about the idea of covering as well as passing. Essentially, the person who is open about the fact that they are part of a minority religion, but must hide the fact that they, or must not engage in any outward sign of it, or is open about the fact that they are married to a partner of the same sex, but does not feel comfortable bringing their partner to a company holiday party. And this is a very common experience, even among the very openly autistic. One can be in a situation in which one has been welcomed to disclose the fact of one's autism, but still be placed under tremendous pressure to do things like make eye contact, or avoid rocking back and forth, or stimming. And this imposes a very real cost. These passing demands, and I'll use the word passing broadly here to refer to both passing and covering. So really any demand to suppress the signs of stigmatized identity, regardless of whether or not one is hiding the fact of it, impose real harms. We have a literature in the context of autism that really gets very specific about this. Passing, and sometimes this literature refers to it as camouflaging or masking, among autistic people is associated with a range of negative outcomes. At the most severe end, things like suicidality, burnout, but also things like depression, poor mental health, exhaustion, and self-esteem problems. And a very big part of the reason for this is that passing imposes cognitive demands. The person who must devote their attention to remembering to make eye contact, or remembering to maintain a typical vocal prosody, or remembering to avoid flapping their hands or avoid rocking back and forth. That is energy that they are not devoting to other activities, whether it's their chosen profession, learning in a classroom, or the simple enjoyment of life. In addition, passing demands the expectation that it is autistic people who need to change exclusively without any change from the broader society, essentially internalize stigma. It doesn't acknowledge that communication is inherently a reciprocal undertaking. Damian Milton in the United Kingdom has written extensively about the concept of the double empathy problem, that we locate the harms or we locate the challenges of autistic, non-autistic interaction entirely in the autistic person. But in practice, because communication generally involves at least two people, we really should be understanding this as a problem that's emerging between two different parties, and that efforts to try and solve or remediate could just as equally involve shared responsibility to make changes to the means and mechanisms of communication. Another problem with passing demands is, quite frankly, the broader world is not very good at teaching people how to pass. I would argue that it's not a goal worth pursuing. But even if we were to accept the ethical and normative framework that traditional autism services imposes upon autistic people, the truth of the matter is that people who are subject to very passing-oriented interventions, such as applied behavioral analysis, generally do not, come across as non-autistic. In fact, it's very frequently the case that because communication is an inherently dynamic and contextual undertaking, where the rules change from context to context, person to person, that behaviorist training and its close cousin, social skills training, at least in its most common forms, really end up teaching people to approach social interaction through a set of hard and fast rules that often don't make them seem typical, but can render them far more vulnerable. So if people are taught that you must always make eye contact, they end up coming across in what's sometimes referred to as an uncanny valley effect. Essentially, they are following the rule too much. And as a result, people find them unusual by virtue of their excess eye contact. Or similarly, if people are taught that you must always smile to show that you are happy, this comes across not in the dynamic or fashion in which the way that one communicates happiness may vary from time to time or person to person, but again, as a hard and fast rule that leaves people in many respects more vulnerable, and may in fact leave people tremendously vulnerable, because social skills training can often teach people can instill in people a very strong need for compliance, and thus subject people to greater vulnerability to abuse and exploitation. People often exit these types of trainings and interventions feeling deeply uncomfortable saying no to service providers. And then, of course, finally, interventions that stress passing really deprive people of time. And sometimes time is one of the most valuable resources. And by the way, this is especially the case for people with more severe forms of impairment. So when you see intensive behavioral interventions, and this is very frequently how applied behavioral analysis, and similar interventions are marketed, taking up 30 to 40 hours of a child's week. What this essentially means is you have imposed a full-time job on a 3 or 4-year-old. And that really separates them from a number of things. First and foremost, it separates them from the everyday experiences of childhood and the opportunity to form meaningful relationships with their family members and with their peers, disabled and non-disabled. But it also really creates a situation in which there is a sacrifice in terms of the amount of hours that can be spent on more meaningful intervention. There's a reason why very frequently our greatest allies in criticism of behaviorist interventions come from other service provision fields like speech-language pathology or occupational therapy, where you see very frequently providers point out that by virtue of the sheer amount of time that's placed into behaviorist intervention, autistic children receive fewer opportunities for other forms of service provision that, in fact, may be far more likely to result in concrete gains for communication, cognition, and a whole host of other things that I think both autistic people and families see as really important and worthwhile goals. So this is the research-based perspective, but let's talk about this for a moment in terms of the personal narrative. The Autistic Passing Project, it's a really excellent project collected by Amanda Vivian, an autistic woman who collected a wide variety of anonymous accounts of passing from autistic people about 14 years ago. And I think it really captures, some of these concepts in very human terms. This is a quote from one anonymous contributor to the Autistic Passing Project. "I am actually at a point now where I rarely leave the house because I don't have the energy to pass. It made me angry and sad and frustrated because I never stopped being autistic. I just learned how to get around in an NT world better. These days, I am pretending to be normal for them, not myself, and that's what hurts." These and many other accounts really capture the dynamic of a service provision culture that is primarily concerned with the imitation of typical appearance and does not adequately account for the internal experience that autistic people have with service provision and intervention, and the ways in which the goals that we may bring to service provision interactions may be profoundly different from the goals that service providers or other people in autistic people's lives may have for them. Okay, so we've talked about these concepts in theory. We've talked about narrative. What are we going to do about it? What concrete changes can we undertake to really shift the way in which we approach autism interventions and a whole host of other interventions in the context of neurological disability? Well, one way we can approach this is by looking at the outcome measures that are commonly utilized in autism research that evaluates interventions. In order to succeed in research, but also by extension in a wide variety of policy and crucially payment contexts, interventions must show that they are effective, that they shift the goals that we recognize as important for autism intervention or service provision. How are those goals measured? Typically through a set of standardized outcome measures that in a randomized clinical trial in the research context are assessed over time for both children or adults in a treatment and a control group. An intervention is judged to be more effective if it modifies more items within an outcome measure, and less effective if it modifies fewer items within an outcome measure, at least in terms of the standard approaches to coding outcome measures. So then it becomes very important to think about what is present within existing outcome measures in autism. So for example, the pervasive developmental disorder behavior inventory includes items like flaps hands up and down. What this means is that any clinical trial that uses the pervasive developmental disorder behavior inventory as a means of assessing intervention efficacy, outcomes, really indicates that intervention is more successful if the service provider reduces the frequency with which an autistic person flaps their hands up and down. Of course, flapping one's hands up and down is not actually harming anyone. In fact, for many of us, it's something that we experience as quite useful, quite helpful. Similarly, the PDDBI, Pervasive Developmental Disorder Behavior Inventory, includes items like making odd or unusual finger movements, putting an unusual stress on words, spinning objects. The social reciprocity scale, which is actually the most commonly used autism outcome measure, includes items like avoiding eye contact or has unusual eye contact, having repetitive behaviors that others consider odd, talking in a monotone voice. Now, these are things that are unquestionably diagnostic of autism. As diagnostic measures, they are in fact appropriate. If you are developing a measure that is designed to tell you, is someone autistic or not, these are things you want to look at. But as means of evaluating the effectiveness of service provision, they're profoundly inappropriate. By what right does the service provider, who is hired by a family or in some jurisdictions paid for by the government or an insurance company in order to assist an autistic person, focus their energies and attentions on trying to control the way they move their hands, or the degree to which they make eye contact, or the manner in which they speak? These are not core to communication or independent living, or any number of the quite legitimate and important goals that service provision has in the context of autistic people across a wide variety of different experiences and degrees of impairment. It is not that service provision is not legitimate or necessary as an undertaking in many, many instances. It is simply that we have to shift what it focuses on. So let's approach this again at a very granular level. This is an example of several items from the social reciprocity scale. So we see avoids eye contact or has unusual eye contact. This is an inappropriate item. Again, it is not an appropriate priority for a service provider to seek out or change. But there are other items here that are appropriate. Has difficulty making friends, even when trying his or her best. It is appropriate for service provision to work to develop someone's skills in trying to make friends. So the idea of intervention or service provision is not inherently illegitimate as a whole. It's just a question of what we should focus on. Unfortunately, when we look at these outcome measures, we see a very high frequency of items that are just profoundly inappropriate and ethically suspect. To kind of extend this to another measure, and I think this kind of illustrates in very vivid terms the nature of the ethical problem, and I would say the conceptual error that we're seeing in autism service provision today. This is the CyBox ASD. CyBox stands for Children's Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. The original CyBox was an outcome measure used in obsessive compulsive disorder. And some autism researchers said, well, okay, we have this measure that's well validated in obsessive compulsive disorder. It's used to measure repetitive behaviors in obsessive compulsive disorder. Autistic people also have repetitive behaviors, but they tend to be somewhat different in appearance. Let's just replace the examples in the CyBox, which are normed to OCD, to examples that are normed to ASD, that are more common for autistic people. But otherwise, we will maintain the same basic framework of the SciBox. Well, a very big problem there, namely that repetitive behaviors in OCD are generally experienced quite differently by the people having them than repetitive behaviors among autistic people. Among people with OCD, repetitive behaviors are a source of distress generally. Among autistic people, repetitive behaviors and focused interests, which are also incorporated in the SciBox ASD, are often a source of pleasure or are sometimes useful coping skills for self-regulation, emotional regulation, managing sensory sensitivities, or any number of other things. So within the SciBox ASD, you have items like ordering and arranging, placing toys, objects, furnitures in an assigned place. Again, these are things that autistic people do, appropriate for diagnosis, inappropriate as a goal or as an intervention goal. Echolalia, repetitive behavior, these are really not things that service providers should be targeting. You do have some legitimate items to target, repetitive sexual behavior, repetitive self-injurious behavior, but there's really a significant problem with the framework that the SciBox undertakes. We also see the SciBox ASD score a person as being more severe if they are more frustrated if they're prevented from performing repetitive behaviors. And again, this is really just the very definition of a clinical passing demand. The ways in which service provision, in which intervention is evaluated, are such that service providers are pressed to push autistic people to pass as non-autistic. The demand to pass is embedded into the very structure of our service provision and intervention infrastructure, from how they are developed to how they are evaluated to how they are implemented in the field. We also see items within the SciBox ASD, again, against resistance against repetitive behavior. If people try and resist more and are putting cognitive energy into reducing the extent to which they stim, then they are judged to be less severe. If they resist less, then they are judged to be more severe. And again, behaviors that are considered to be more peculiar by others, very definition of incorporating stigma into the clinical process, are judged to be more severe. Behaviors that are seen as more typical by others are judged to be less severe. So one question that emerges in these conversations is, why are you so concerned about clinical passing demands that emerge within the context of service provision or intervention? After all, passing demands exist in a very broad way throughout a society. Passing demands are in some ways present in a diffuse way all around us, right? The child on the playground that laughs at the child who is rocking back and forth is in effect reinforcing a societal passing demand. The extent to which someone might face discrimination in employment by virtue of not making eye contact is once again reinforcing this diffuse societal passing demand that always exists. So why are we particularly concerned with clinical passing demands? Aren't service providers just essentially preparing people to participate in an intolerant world? Well, there are reasons why clinical passing demands actually constitute a much greater risk and impose greater harm than non-clinical ones. First, the context of intervention, it creates a dynamic that is very different from the diffuse and generalized passing demands that one might experience in day-to-day life, whether in school as a child or in employment or in the broader society as an adult. A service provider has tremendous power over the person they are delivering services to, especially, but not exclusively, for children. Clinical passing demands are also very different from diffuse societal passing demands. In broad everyday life, it's generally the case that we can remove oneself from contexts in which we feel unwelcome. There are exceptions to this, but it's relatively rare outside of the clinical context that one is forced to stay in a place where one is consistently and constantly and irrevocably drilled to be something that they are not. One of the few exceptions to this is in the clinical context. Clinical passing demands are more immediate, they're harder to escape, and they're more totalizing. Because service provision is evaluated by these outcome measures, which really do not allow for differences across contexts, clinical passing demands really create a dynamic which presents the passing demand almost as an ethical imperative to autistic persons. It is not, you are going into a job interview, maybe you want to try and make eye contact for 30 minutes to increase the likelihood that you'll get the job, but it's up to you. It is, from a very young age, children are taught that to not make eye contact is wrong, and to make eye contact is right. This is a totalizing demand in a way that's very different from anything we see in the broader society. So I think this is something that really should orient us towards neurodiversity advocacy that is very focused at changing the culture of service provision, and beginning with not just these outcome measures, although that's very important, but beginning with what's downstream of these measures, the intervention modalities that have internalized this approach of thinking about autism that assumes that the challenges that autistic people face are necessarily downstream of autistic traits. So this traditional approach would say autistic people frequently struggle with social communication. They also frequently do not make eye contact. And as a result, the goal of autism intervention should be to make autistic people make eye contact. And as a result, the social communication challenges will go away. This is not really tremendously well supported by the research and really kind of fails some basic tests of logic in the sense that it's quite possible, I think we have a great many reasons to believe, that lack of eye contact and social communication challenges are both characteristic of something we call autism, but they do not necessarily follow one from the other. Causing someone to make eye contact is not necessarily, and is probably quite unlikely, to teach them the skills to succeed in the realm of social communication, which involves a great deal more than remembering to look people in the eye. In fact, because it imposes cognitive demands and may take up attention and energy and time that could be focused elsewhere, it may actively harm efforts to try and develop additional social communication skills, as well as imposing other kinds of harm, as we've discussed. So a couple of key points here. There's a need to separate diagnosis and outcome measurement from each other. We cannot say that just because something is diagnostic of autism, that it is an appropriate outcome for autism service provision. We should maintain a strong presumption against the use of passing demands. Essentially, we really should not be operating by our current status quo, in which we assume that anything that is characteristic of autism or any other disability is something that should be targeted for intervention. In fact, we should maintain the opposite presumption. We should say that we really should only target something for intervention if we can make an affirmative case that it is harmful and that intervention to try and suppress it which we know to have potential costs and risks of imposing harm, is necessary. This is not to say that it's impossible to meet this standard, but that we should really, again, be very skeptical and require a relatively high evidentiary standard to be made by the service provision industry to accept the premise that we should be targeting particular autistic traits for intervention. So one thing I do want to point out here, and this is an area perhaps where my approach to neurodiversity differs somewhat from the approach that you may have heard online or that you may use yourself. The word neurodiversity, it has over the years come to mean a great many different things. When I first got started in neurodiversity advocacy 20 years ago or so, neurodiversity was primarily seen as an ethical argument. It was seen as a normative framework, a way of saying that we should be changing the way service provision, research, and society as a whole approach autistic people and people with other neurological disabilities. Today, in many circles, the word neurodiversity has become a means of description, almost a disability euphemism. Some people use the word neurodiversity, whereas in the same way that they might have used the word disability in other contexts, as if to imply that they no longer consider autism within the framework of disability. I have a problem with that. I actually am quite comfortable with the language of disability, mostly because I've spent my life in the disability rights movement. And when I argue for neurodiversity, I see myself as really arguing for a set of concepts that are rooted in a disability politics and are quite actually closely connected with ideas that come from, say, the deaf community, the blind community, wheelchair users, people with other mental disabilities. So you've seen the emergence of neurodiversity as a descriptive term without necessarily any clear normative content. You see this in the use of the word neurodivergent or neurodivergence, which some people have argued for as a way of trying to be more inclusive of disabilities other than autism under the concept of neurodiversity. I don't love this, both because to me, the word disability itself represents the broad coalition I want to be a part of, but also because it seems to imply that there is some group that we refer to as neurodivergent, to which the neurodiversity model should apply, and another group that is not neurodivergent, to which the normative claims of neurodiversity should not apply, and which the medical model should control on an exclusive basis. I think that's a really big mistake. To me, neurodiversity has relevance to everyone, no matter how severely impaired. There is not a neurodivergent population and a disabled population. There are disabled people, broadly defined, and neurodiversity, this concept which has things to say about how we should be approaching disabled people and how we should be changing the ways in which we are providing services to us. In addition, the opposite is also true. There are some things in which medical model goals are appropriate, even among the mildly impaired. So this growing tendency, and you see it in recent proposals to establish this new construct of profound autism, which some parent advocates, I think quite misguidedly, are using to try and segment off this new diagnostic construct that will be separate from the world of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity really should not be seen as something that's only relevant for people with mild impairments, and the medical model should not be seen as something that's only relevant for people with severe impairments. In fact, within the same person or population, different disability-related traits have different ethical implications. And neurodiversity may be appropriate in some contexts. Again, things like the rejection of demands for eye contact or efforts to suppress stimming. And the medical model may be appropriate in other contexts, such as efforts to address self-injurious behavior, or provide people with access to language as a means of communication, or the avoidance of cognitive impairment. So this leaves us with this really important question, and I think we'll cover it relatively briefly and then close for questions, of under what circumstances might targeting traits associated with autism for reduction be legitimate? If neurodiversity applies, generally, and that is our working presumption, but you have a rebuttable presumption, but it's a rebuttable presumption, and you can rebut it. Under what circumstances can you make the case for an intervention goal that reduces traits associated with autism? So in our paper, we propose a two-part test. The first part is, does an intervention serve a non-passing purpose? What do I mean by that? Essentially, you must be able to answer the question, why? Why are you doing this? With something other than, well, this is how normal people behave. This is what normal people look like. Or conversely, we must target this trait because this is associated with autism. So again, you can see how this by itself really introduces an important conversation, because given that we have these interventions that focus on things like targeting children's stacking of objects in a particular order of size or color as an appropriate province of service provision, simply asking, why are you doing this? What is the ethical justification of this? And seeing the response that people give provides a wealth of information in and of itself. It should be possible to interrogate the purpose of an intervention. And if the best that people can give us here is, well, this makes the child or adult look more normal, then that really fails this test. I would say also by extension that if the purpose that you're arguing for really flows through the fact that it makes someone look more normal, then that should also fail this test. Seeking to make it easier for people to have friends is a legitimate non-passing purpose. But if the way that you're doing that is saying, well, we need to make the person look more normal because it will make it easier for them to have friends, all we're really doing is replicating that societal stigma of the playground and distilling it and imposing it with all of the force and power of the clinic or service provider. In contrast, if we are, for example, teaching someone turn taking or other tools of social reciprocity, that is a legitimate non-passing purpose. In order to be more likely to have friends, there are reasons entirely separate from typical appearance where it may be useful for someone to be able to make friends, to be able to take turns with someone. Ditto perspective taking. There are very legitimate reasons entirely separate from typical appearance why it is useful to be able to put oneself in another person's shoes. Ditto, the reduction of self-injury. It's very clear that there are benefits to someone not hurting themselves that have nothing to do with the fact that hurting oneself makes one look weird. So this by itself is a really important interrogation of an intervention goal. But it isn't where our test stops. We also argue that an intervention to fulfill that goal, to pursue that goal, has to be the least burdensome means of accomplishing that purpose. And here we argue that burden should be defined exclusively in terms of the burden experienced by the autistic person, rather than the broader society. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we see this very clearly in the context of physical disability, and it may vary considerably from person to person, that there are a wide variety of ways that we can accomplish a particular goal. And we should be responsive to the demands placed on a disabled person in pursuing those means. So for a person with a mobility impairment, they may accomplish mobility through the use of a wheelchair or through the use of crutches. For some people, the demands of crutches may not be sufficient to compensate for the, it may not be sufficient, it may be too great to be compensated for by the greater mobility that they provide. It's going to vary very much by the person. And in this sense, it's really the same principle can be applied in the context of autism, that particular interventions, are evaluated in large part by the degree of burden that they impose on an autistic person, how that's experienced by autistic people. So I'm going to close here with a quote from Kenji Yoshino, who about 24 years ago wrote what I consider to be one of the best books about covering, again, that close cousin of passing, not the hiding of the fact of stigmatized identity, but the signs of it. Civil rights practice is fundamentally about who has to change. As we think about the ways in which we want our society to evolve, to be more inclusive of autistic people and to welcome us throughout society, I think this is really core to a civil rights-oriented approach to autism. By shifting service provision practice in measurable and specific ways, we can operationalize neurodiversity in a way that will be quite specific, that will make our goals clearer and clearer to the broader society, both family members, service providers, and most importantly, our own community, and give us a greater chance to build a better world for the next generation of autistic people and the broader society, autistic, disabled, and not. I thank you for your role in that work. I thank you for your participation in the global neurodiversity movement, and I appreciate the opportunity to work alongside you in our shared commitment to building a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Very inspiring. I got curious about reading this paper and even translating it. I think it would be very useful and very important for the discussion, the debate on all these issues here in Brazil. Thank you very much again. While you were presenting, Guilherme sent me some questions. Some of them have already been answered by the very flow of your speech, but I would like to adapt them in order to cover some aspects which you haven't talked about. The first thing, Ari, is the following. You mentioned many times during your talk behavior analysis, right? Mm-hmm. Here in Brazil, applied behavior analysis, ABA, is one of the approaches which are defended by many people and respected by many people. And one of the reasons, one of the justifications, let's say, people use is its scientific nature. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about the word scientific used to qualify this kind of approach? And based on what you said, could these kinds of approach be improved or, let's say, corrected if they focused only on what you said here, what is the core to communication, or they have other problems that would make them completely problematic? What do you think?
So ABA certainly markets itself as scientific, but I think it would be more accurate to say that ABA adopts the aesthetic of science without embracing its substance. there is this long-standing problem, that ABA providers will tell families that if you place your child in 30 to 40 hours a week of ABA, it will recover them, will make them non-autistic. This particular claim comes from a 1987 study from O. Ivar Lovaas, the father of ABA in the context of autism, broadly speaking. The study actually is interesting by virtue of the fact that Lovaas refused to create a randomized control group. He instead of randomizing treatment participant, randomizing study participants between treatment and control, he essentially said that would be unethical, because he was so confident that his service provision method worked. Instead, the control group really was what we term a waitlist control. It was people who lived too far away from Lovaas's clinic, such that he didn't have the resources to serve them. And that's, scientifically, it's a very big problem. In fact, subsequently, when we have seen randomized controlled trials looking at higher versus lower intensity behavioral interventions, you don't actually see a difference between them. So one of the foundational claims, it's essentially marketing that APA makes around this 30 to 40 hours a week claim, is really just not well supported at all. Lovaas's remark about it being unethical to evaluate his modality through a typical randomized controlled trial framework puts me in mind of this old story about a famous surgeon visiting a medical school to give a lecture on his new surgical technique. As he is orating in front of the audience, a young medical student raises their hand and says, have you considered randomly assigning patients to receive the treatment and not to receive the treatment? The surgeon says, do you mean to suggest that I should flip a coin as to which of my patients shall have the benefit of my great surgery? The medical student says, yes, I do. Well, that, the surgeon announces, would be dooming half of my patients to death. The young medical student says in a small voice, which half? And this is, of course, the fundamental problem with this approach. Lovaas was so confident that his modality worked that it was never truly evaluated. Now, there are other really significant problems with behaviorist intervention. One is that the goal of indistinguishability from peers has been really heavily embedded into behaviorist practice. Is it theoretically possible to see behaviorist interventions that pursue more meaningful goals? Theoretically, and some people have wrote papers arguing that it is possible to see a neurodiversity affirming applied behavioral analysis. Well, there's a very big difference between theory and practice, and I'm very skeptical of this. We really have not seen any evidence of changes in the field in how ABA is being provided. In fact, even some of the newer waves of ABA, which have a little bit more research support than Lovaas's approach, and there are still some significant problems with that research. The newer waves themselves have not seen the broad adoption that is sometimes claimed. So what I worry about, frankly, is a sort of a bait and switch, where we see this very heavy emphasis on what is theoretically possible in changing behaviorist practice, while at the same time,
Excuse me, Ari, it seems we have a connection problem. Okay, let's see if Ari comes back. Ok. So, professor Ari está enfrentando um problema técnico, provavelmente ele voltará em alguns instantes. Bem, enquanto o professor está tentando retornar aqui para continuar sua resposta, eu vou fazer uma breve tradução do que ele comentou, né?
You'll have to forgive me. We had a little bit of technical difficulties there. Where did you lose me?
No, I think you can continue from 1 minute ago, I think.
Well, what I would say again is what I really worry about is there's all of this discussion about what ABA could be. And it's, of course, theoretically possible. We might see major changes. But I fear that this emphasis on this idealized ABA that so far there's really only evidence exists in theory has distracted us from what ABA is in practice and what is being sold to families with great and reckless abandon right now. So if we want to have a conversation about reforming ABA, I would encourage ABA's defenders to go out and talk to their colleagues and make change on the ground. If ABA looks different 10 or 20 years from now, let's have the conversation then. But for the moment, the goal of neurodiversity advocacy should be having a meaningful discussion about what ABA is in the field today. And at the moment, in the field today, it is something that is very much in conflict with neurodiversity.
And Ari, based on that, while you were answering, I was thinking about Lova's. There's a story concerning his relationship with theories on cure for gay people, right? Is that correct?
That's right. Lovas was a collaborator with George Reckers. Together they operated something called the UCLA Feminine Boys Project, which endeavored to use behaviorist methods to, quote unquote, recover children deemed to be at risk of homosexuality. It's a similar underlying theoretical framework to how Lovas approached autism. Obviously, not exactly identical, but there are some disturbing parallels.
Okay. And how do you see the other possibilities, the other approaches, such as DIR floor time, therefore floor time, search, Jasper? Can you say something about these other possibilities?
So without endorsing any particular modality, I do think there's a lot of promise to the play-based interventions and the more developmental interventions. Both because I think the underlying philosophy behind them are better aligned with neurodiversity, not perfectly aligned, of course, but better aligned. But also because they're often delivered in a very different way. So one other thing that I think we often forget about ABA is it's a model that seems calibrated to delivery in the least expensive way possible. And by least expensive, I refer to the expense to the service provider. It's often quite expensive to families and to the state. ABA is typically delivered by this class of professional called registered behavior technicians, who are essentially
Okay. Another technical issue. Ok, professor voltará logo mais. Nós estamos aqui falando, só para adiantar um pouco a questão da tradução, lembrando que teremos legendas disponibilizadas após essa transmissão. O professor estava refletindo a respeito de diferentes abordagens para as pessoas autistas, né? Ele estava falando um pouco sobre as questões do ABA e de algumas outras abordagens agora.
Am I back?
Welcome back.
All right. You would think Harvard would have better Wi-Fi.
No, but it was very quick, no problem.
Well, it's, as you can tell, it's, university is having a hard time paying the bills lately, but that's another conversation. What I would say is I think it's notable that generally speaking, ABA is delivered primarily by minimally trained paraprofessionals, whereas oftentimes the play-based interventions generally involve a greater degree of engagement from an SLP or an OT who may be more likely to have a more sophisticated theory of language development, or motor movement, or a host of other areas in which it's quite legitimate and important, to be able to craft meaningful intervention goals. So without saying, without delivering an endorsement to any particular modality, I would say that a lot of the other developmental or play-based approaches have a greater likelihood of alignment with neurodiversity principles.
Okay, Ari. I think a final question. We have time for a final one, last one. Would you share with us here in Brazil any specific experience, initiative, project you have witnessed concerning neurodiversity, which could inspire our projects here?
One thing that I think is really quite powerful has been the growing wave of autistic researchers in autism research. The first great wave of neurodiversity, really, the first great wave of neurodiversity advocacy focused on the development of the critique, essentially the condemnation of what, has dominated the field of autism service provision. But the next great wave, what we are seeing develop now, is autistic people enter the research and even the service provision realms, and to play a direct role in trying to build something better. So I guess the advice that I would give is do not stop at condemnation. Condemnation is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We have to build the alternative. I think one of the great mistakes that we've made in prior decades in neurodiversity advocacy is we've told families what not to do, but we've left them without a clear path about what to do. Well, we can't necessarily present ourselves as having all the answers. We shouldn't present ourselves as having all the answers. In autism, anyone who says they have all the answers is trying to sell you something. We can, be more meaningful partners in building and implementing the alternative. I believe in that very strongly, and I'm very excited that there is this growing cohort of autistic researchers and service providers that are playing a key role in transforming the field of service provision to see greater acceptance of our ideas.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harry. I think it was very important for us, for everybody who is watching us, listening to you, right? Thank you very much. I think it was a great beginning for our event, Fórum Diversamente. I hope we can listen to you more frequently and read your paper soon.
By all means, please feel free to share the paper broadly. I'd be glad to send you a copy, and feel free to share my email with your group members. I'm glad to be a resource if I can, and thank you. Thank you to you and to Guilherme and to Autistas Brazil for the opportunity to speak with you tonight.
Thank you very much. I'll talk now. I'll speak now in Portuguese just to conclude here our meeting. Agradecemos a todos os espectadores. Reforçamos que na segunda-feira, dia 20 de outubro, teremos o Fórum Diversamente e disponibilizaremos também conteúdos referentes a todas essas discussões que já estão sendo feitas, começando hoje com esse aquecimento. Muito obrigado.